All right, hi everybody. We're gonna get started here. My name is Jamie. I'm the Nature Center Director here at Chik-Wauk, and I am happy to introduce Mark Morgen today. He's been a Grand Marais resident for 6 years after his retirement from 3M, and since then, probably with a little bit more free time that he might have now, he's been doing lots of building of canoes and kayaks. He's built over 20, plus an additional sailboat that he has constructed as well. He might be losing some of that free time to building boats though, because he's got a new grandbaby that just arrived a few weeks ago. But today he's going to be telling us about the process of building a wood canvas canoe and some other technical parts of it as well. Just a reminder that these presentations are free, but we do have a donation bucket in the back. And this is in partnership with Visit Cook County, Chik-Wauk, and the Gunpla Trail Historical Society. So I will proudly now introduce Mark to you guys.
Well, thank you very much. As Jamie said, my name is Mark Morgen, and I'm a retired engineer from 3M, but I'm still okay guy. So a little bit about myself, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about history of canoes in general, and then we'll get on to the process of how I built this canoe, and then if you have any questions afterwards, we'll just have open questions. So anyway, so I actually started building canoes while I was still working, and kind of came about. My friends and I, we were scout leaders at the scout troop in our community, and the kids obviously grew up and moved away and went to school, and we still hung out together. And I had breakfast on Saturday mornings at the local cafe, and they spent a lot of time in my shop just because we first used it for building birdhouses and pinewood derby cars and scout projects. And then at breakfast, one of us said, well, not me, said, I always wanted to build a wood canoe. We should learn how to build canoes. So there was 4 or 5 of us at the time. So I said, sure, why not? We bought a book. There was a place down in St. Paul, Northwest Canoe Company, that had classes. We didn't take any classes, but we went down there to buy materials and stuff. And they were really open. They had a class going, and they had a boat right there. And it seemed like every time we got to a step, they were at that step for whatever class they were building, and so we could kind of nose in, and they were real helpful with getting us started. So it started out, we built 3 wood strip canoes, cedar strip canoes. They're all the same plan. So, and as they say, you build the first boat and give it to somebody you don't like. You build the second boat, give it to somebody you like, and you keep the third boat for yourself. And it turned out that's how it worked, so I got the third boat. Anyway. And then I wanted a solo boat. These were all tandems. So I built a solo boat. And then at the same time, we were coming up here on the Gunflint, staying at Bearskin Lodge for our weekly summer vacation. And I brought my canoes up there and paddled them around. And Sue and Bob, one of them, said, hey, do you ever sell those canoes? And I thought, well, everything's for sale, right? So, especially boats. So I built another one, and then we hung it in Bearskin's Lodge. It's still there. I don't think it's ever been in the water unless Andy or Quinn, stuck it out one night and paddled around the bay. So it's still there, never sold. I don't think I got any sales out of that. But that was kind of the start, and word of mouth got around. And we sold a couple, and then I found another design that I thought, oh, that looks kind of nice. I'd like to do that. So I built another one. I'd sell them after I used them for a year, maybe. So this kind of generated on, and we moved up here. So that was kind of the start of my canoe building. We did build a couple of kayaks, and my partner, boat building partner, kind of evolved into just 2 of us. He built a couple of kayaks for his kids, so we built those in the shop as well. Anyway, so I always wanted to build a wood canvas canoe, so that was kind of always my dream. So I've done some restoration on them, and as you've probably ever seen wood canvas canoes, they get stored on the ground upside down, so the gunnels always, the the stems and the sterns always rot. So I replaced a few of those on canoes. Anyway, so moving on, let's talk about the history of kind of canoes, and then we'll get back to the wood canvas one. So I've got notes here. So a couple weeks ago, we had the canoe book guy, Mark Niesel, is that his name? Anyway, I stole some of this from him. But anyway, so really in the late 1800s and early 1900s is really when wood canvas or wood canoes started replacing birch bark canoes. We've all hopefully seen, there's several examples of birch bark canoes on the Gunflint Trail and lodges and places like that. And those are always largely built one-off. So, you know, it's the really good native person knows how to do them, everybody come to him and they build a canoe, one at a time. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the recreation industry really picked up and people wanted boats. And so it just wasn't economical to build them one at a time by hand. So they had to figure out a way to build them kind of mass produced, because that's what Americans do, is we mass produce things and do it very well. So with the surge of our interest, there was a lot of canoe companies, mostly on the East Coast, Maine, and then northern Canada there, just above the border, where they did a lot of experimentation with, they started out with planking and strips, kind of battens and the seams to keep them waterproof. They started with double planks, so they kind of overlap, like a lap joint to keep the water out. But even then, those were very time consuming and weren't real economical for the day. I think a canoe at that time, for $5 you could get a wood canoe. So you wanted to make it pretty cheap. So then eventually they kind of came to invented the kind of canoe form. So I couldn't bring mine today. I have one canoe form, which I built my canoe on, and it weighs about 500 or 600 pounds. And I only had one of my friends around, and I didn't think he and I could lift it together to bring it on the trailer. So basically it looks just like the canoe, except it's built of a lot thicker wood, plywood or 3/4 inch wood, and has metal strips around it. And those are where the ribs on the canoe would go, as if you saw it out there. So that's kind of the evolution of the wood canoe. And eventually they got away from the double layers of wood and came to the canvas and waterproofed that and stretched it, and that was kind of the first mass production kind of canoe industry that was there. And it started mostly in Maine. I think Evan Garish is the name I came across on the internet, and we all know how accurate the internet is. But he was kind of the one that first invented the forms and the canvas, and then of course E.M. White and B.N. Morris, two very famous canoe building names, Chestnut in Petersburg in Canada, Old Town, Ruston Canoes in the States. So they were really the pioneers of the wood canvas canoes. And then of course, evolving from there, you know, we've got aluminum canoes, and those really came about after World War II, when the aircraft industry, which were pumping out fighter planes, you know, left and right by the thousands, at the end of the war, they needed something to do with all this aluminum they had, and lo and behold, they made a pretty good canoe. So they were more durable than a wood canvas. They weighed about as much. They weren't lightweight, but the durability, and they were cheap because they could stamp them out with the big presses and rivet them together. And then later on in the early 60s, I think fiberglass canoes came available, and they weren't really any lighter than an aluminum canoe either. I think they were probably easier to make because they could spray them on, and they last pretty well. They don't stand up in the weather a lot if you leave them outside. And then kind of an offshoot, a Royal X canoe. I don't know if everybody's seen those. Those are real heavy plastic, and they're heavy, but they really take a beating. So they're great for river running. You run them up on a rock, they slide over rocks easy. If you wrap them around a rock, as sometimes you do in a river, they'll pop right back out, and a lot of times the gunnels will pop out too. And then of course, getting to be my favorite, for trips anyway, is Kevlar canoes, because they're so light. So, and who knows you know, what's the next miracle material? You know, sometimes it's kind of creepy when you're paddling a Kevlar canoe and you can kind of see the water, you know, it's pretty thin. And the first time I saw that, I'm like, oh boy. But, you know, they are very durable and strong. Although I've cut them before, so they do cut very easily. So, anyway, that's kind of a brief history of canoes as I see it. Very high level overview. So, anyway, so I've always wanted to build a wood canvas canoe. And mostly because I'm kind of an old-timey guy. I like wood paddles still. I build wood cedar strip canoes, even though they're not very woody anymore. The wood is really just a shell for the fiberglass and the epoxy resin. So they're not really a wood boat. But I think the wood canvas canoes have much of the same advantages that a birch bark canoe is. They're built from local materials, so you can constantly repair them. They really last a long time if you take care of them and you keep the maintenance up. And, you know, yeah, you get a tear in the canvas, and you know, duct tape will work for a while, and then you can, you know, patch it permanently. If a rib breaks, you can pull it out and replace it. So they're very durable and long-lasting. I've got one upstairs in my shop that's been sitting since we moved here and a few years prior to that, but it's a 1937 Old Town guide canoe, 20-foot long. I'm gonna get that repaired some of these days. It's in pretty rough shape, but you can replace every part on it, you know, and save the good stuff, and it'll be a great canoe. So maybe that'll be my next canoe. So, who knows? Anyway. So, I bought this form from Stewart River Canoes, which is in Knife River, Minnesota, between Two Harbors and Duluth on the shore. Alex sold me this. It was a canoe that he doesn't make anymore, so he wanted to get rid of the form. And he sold it to me really cheap, because these things can be pretty expensive. So I think I bought it. Did I buy it before we moved up here? I don't know. I think not, because I wouldn't have hauled it twice. Anyway. So within the last year, I bought that. But even before that, I knew I wanted to build one. So a friend of mine in Stillwater, Minnesota, which is just east of Minneapolis, St. Paul, was moving to Atlanta, and he used to restore boats, and he was getting rid of a lot of his materials. And boat builders are always looking for wood, and sometimes they're looking for the wood for their next boat or the next boat. So he had ribs already pre-made, and he had planking already pre-cut, and he was moving. And I thought, well, someday I'm going to need that wood. And so it was before we moved. So that was at least 7 years ago. I bought that, put it up in my new shop, and it's been sitting for a long time. But it wasn't my next canoe or my next canoe, but it was several after that. So last winter I thought, well, this is the winter. I don't have anything planned necessarily. I'm going to build this canoe. So wheeled out the form, put it on sawhorses, and it's big. It's as big as a canoe, 17 feet, weighs a lot. And so first thing that I had to do was measure the ribs and steam them. So I've got props. I don't believe in PowerPoint anymore since I retired. So I had plenty of that. I don't have any, so whatever happened, I had exactly enough rib material for the canoe. These are just cutoffs for the shorter ones. But the ribs are made of white cedar. You can toss these around if you want. They're pretty lightweight. They're as long as they need to be. We taper them at the ends just to make them look a little nicer. But it's straight grain, white cedar, a really pretty wood to work with. I built a steam box. So steam boxes are basically just long boxes made out of plywood, or I've used PVC pipe, you know, for a steam box. This one I had some leftover particle board. Didn't work very well for a steam box because it kind of swelled up and stuff. It worked good enough for this one, but it's not going to be around for the next one. But I had the material, and why not? So anyway, so you measured up. Every rib is basically a different length. So cut them all, pre-cut them all, marked them up, put them in the steam box, and one at a time, I had a friend of mine, you basically just put them on the form and bend them over, and the inner gunnels are already on the canoe, on the form, and you just put a couple of nails through them. And the nails that we use are copper. You want to use copper. You can pass these around. These are just leftovers. So they're ring shag nails, so they've got little ring bridges on them so they don't pull out easily. So anyway, that's basically the process. And I think there's 60 ribs in the canoe. So it took, if I was good at it and did it all, I think we could have done it in one day. We spread it out over 2 days just because it took a little while to get going and figure out how to do it. I broke a couple of ribs, especially toward the bow of the stern where you're bending the ribs almost, in a V shape because it's so sharp there. And we broke a couple of those, and we had to go back and we soaked them in hot water for a couple of days to get them to bend. They still cracked a little bit, but they're okay. So that was basically the process of the ribs. So we let them sit for a couple of days just to dry out and kind of retain their shape. They do pop back a little bit, so I kept some tension with, I just had a couple of straps around it. So we put the stems on. I actually got stems pre-bent from Alex when I bought the canoe mold, so that was fortunate. Otherwise, the stems are basically made out of ash. So ash is another traditional boat building, canoe building wood. It's lightweight, it's very strong, it really flexes. You might seem like it's really stiff here, but for gunnels and stuff where it's long, you don't have to really steam it or anything. It'll be very flexible and retain its shape after a while. But the stems, which are the wood pieces that on each end that curve down, and if you look at the boat out there, you'll see them sticking up on the inside. That's the stem material there, and then I ended up using the outer gunnels as ash too. Next came the planking. So we've got to cover the planking, cover the ribs with the planking. And this is a couple of leftover pieces of planking. It's cedar as well. This is red cedar, which isn't optimal for it. Most of the wood on there is white cedar. This is some leftovers I had to use because I was a little bit short. But basically it's the same way. It's straight grained. It's very rot resistant. Cedar is very rot resistant. So, it's a canoe, so there's going to get water in it, either from the rain or from the lake, eventually. So you want something that dries out and doesn't rot. And so the process of that is basically, as you'll see out there, is you just start at the top and you nail them on to the ribs. Now, the mold, the form that the ribs are on, has got metal bands on it that go across the whole rib and right where the ribs go. And the reason for that is that you're nailing the planking onto the ribs with they call them actually canoe tacks. That's actually the name of these little brass tacks. And they're long enough so that they'll go through the planking, they'll go through the ribs, and just a little bit will stick out through that, and when you nail them down, it'll hit that metal band and it'll bend and cinch back, and that prevents it from pulling out. So basically it locks it in. So these are the brass canoe tacks that we use on the canoe, and there's hundreds, if not more than 1,000 on that canoe. And you just lay it out there. Mostly the cedar strips are long enough and flexible enough that you don't have to worry about steaming them or anything like that. Only a couple of places where the bottom and the sides come and the bilge kind of rounds out where it gets kind of curvy. For that, we would put some hot water. We just soak a rag on a stick with hot water, rub it over the wood, and it'll just bend right over there. You don't have to steam it, just a little bit of hot water. Once it's bent over, tack it in, and it'll be good forever. So that took maybe 3 days to do, and a lot of that was because you can use big flat wide pieces in the middle, but when it gets to the end, you got to kind of shape them and you know, angle them and make them fit nice and tight together. So that was the process for that. So now we've got a wood boat, but it's got a lot of air gaps in it. So we want to take care of that. And that's was kind of the secret sauce for the wood canvas canoe. So the canvas that we use is just basically 10-ounce canvas. And to put it on, so canvas is really stretchy. And you want, it'll shrink and swell as, you know, humidity and water and stuff. So when you put it on the canoe, you want it stretched really tight. And that was really one of the tricky parts that I read about it, I knew how to do it. It helped that I had a friend of mine that had done this before, Mike Birch, he lives here locally too. Anyway, so I had the boat building community is very small but very large. There's a friend of mine down in Lutsen or Tofty area, Jim King, who restores a lot of canoes. So he lent me the elaborate stretching tool, which is, you know, basically 2 pieces of 2x4, and there are actually nails in between here, and you basically stretch the canvas out over the canoe, and you pull it very tight. So most people that do this for a living have these big elaborate anchor systems and they can stretch this canoe. So since I didn't, I screwed a couple of eye bolts to the bottom of the floor, or to the bottom of the wall by the floor, and hooked one of these to that. And then the other one, I just backed up my car in the garage, opened the doors, and I didn't drive the car to stretch it. We put a cover on it, so I hooked it to the hitch, and we just winched it, and then let it sit for a little bit till it kind of relaxed, and we winched it again, and it gets very, you know, as tight as a drum, basically. And at that point, then you've got the canoe sitting in there, and it's all stretched around it tight, and you just basically take those ring shank nails again, or I think we use a staple gun. You can use a staple gun too. Stretch it up over the gunnel, and then just staple it on at every rib, so about every 3-4 inches. So you do that, just a little pucker on it, so that's when you know it's just right, when you get just that right amount of pucker on it. And you go do that, and it takes just a very few minutes. I was a little nervous. I was watching the wall, making sure it didn't start moving. An outside wall, and you don't want that. But it seemed to work fine, and I'll leave those eye bolts in there, because who knows. Everything I do, I try to build, make a pattern or a jig, because you never know when you might use another one. So, in and of itself, canvas, of course, is not waterproof. We all know that. Everybody had a canvas tent when you were a kid, and your dad said, okay, don't touch the tent because it'll start leaking. And so, you know, we know that we don't want to touch the canoe because it'll start leaking. So, anyway, so every canoe manufacturer had their secret sauce recipe to waterproof the canvas. And, you know, basically they were mixtures of turpentine and some kind of resin and a bunch of clay. And they would apply this to their canoes. And that was kind of the one hitch in the mass production processes, because that since it was an oily, resiny, not really paint, kind of a glob, it would take several weeks, if not months, to dry. So, you know, you'd have these canoes stacked up in the warehouse drying. Of course, things have changed since then, and people have come up with all kinds of different mixtures of stuff to do this. I'll let you in on my secret. It's Super Deck by Sherwin-Williams. It goes on very well. You rub it in and get it into the weave really tight. You put several coats on. You can sand it in between to get it nice and smooth. So it works pretty well. and that makes it waterproof. So then it's, basically you can put whatever paint that you want on it. So we decided on blue. Every canvas canoe I've seen, it was like either that kind of reddish canoe or the dark forest green or blue. And we were down, my wife and I were down in Madison this spring at the canoe show. And the Wisconsin Heritage Canoe Museum was down there, and they had a red one and a green one and a blue one. And we looked at them and we like blue. So we bought blue paint. This is fancy boat building paint, but the last canoe that I restored, I just went down and got red Rust-Oleum, and it works just fine too. But anyway, here's the canvas with the primer on it and their waterproofing, and then just one coat of paint. Obviously, I put more coats of that paint on the canoe, so it makes it look a little better. But you can kind of see the whole process of making a waterproof canvas canoe.
3M should make something like that.
What's that?
3M should make the coating.
They could, but you'd probably pay too much.
Well, they'd have another lawsuit if they used white lead.
Yeah. I use a lot of their sandpaper, I do that. So, anyway. So that was basically, the only thing left after that is basically put the outer gunnels on. And as I said, I used ash for the outer gunnels. The inner gunnels ended up being white spruce, and just because I had some of that I got from that friend that sold me the ribs, which is another traditional boat building gunnel material. So the boat itself is very traditional, I guess. The one other piece that I have, I've got a brass stem band on it, just on the outside, and that just kind of protects it from the rocks and stuff. That, of course, we have rocks around here, but it's sand and anything. Just it's abrasion resistant. It's just a piece of glass. But again, it's made for the canoe industry. Comes in all sizes. That happens to be the size we use. The seats I built myself too. Almost all the seats, I think maybe even all the seats that I made on my canoes, I built them myself. I actually use a flat nylon material, and I weave them like a snowshoe, so it looks like a snowshoe weave. I don't know, it's fairly comfortable, and it's easy to do, and it's distinctive, so I keep doing that. And now I can pretty much do it in my sleep. I've done so many of them. But anyway, so that's my canoe. I guess one other thing is the oak deck. So the deck's on little triangle pieces in the bow and the stern. A friend of mine gave me a chunk of white oak. It's probably 40 years old. It's got a nice patina on it, so I thought that looks kind of nice to use. So I did that. I put my little logo in it. The thwarts I made out of ash. And that's my process of that. See if I got some notes. So I guess my future boat building escapades. So I asked my wife what she wanted, if she wanted me to build anything boat-wise, and she surprisingly did. So I've got plans. I've had plans for 15 years, probably, of a double kayak. The very first boat I built was a kayak for nominally for my son, but it's up in our shop because they don't have any room for it. Weighs about 3 times as much as it needs to, because I was the first epoxy project I ever did, and I put way too much on. But at the time, I also bought plans for a double kayak. So I think that'll be my winter project, is a double kayak. After that, as Jamie said, we have for our grandchild. I'll probably already have plans to build him a little canoe, maybe a solo canoe. Maybe 10 or 11 feet, maybe.
They have little bassinet, plans for a little bassinet.
I've seen those. Unfortunately, I don't think they have room in their house for that size.
Treasure forever.
I know. And since I built the sailboat 2 winters ago, maybe I'll build another small sailboat and he can learn how to sail too. So. Anyway, those are my future plans. So, are there any questions? I'm not a professional boat builder. I'm a self-taught amateur, but I'll try to answer any questions that you have. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned that the nails were copper And then the brads were brass. Why the different materials?
I don't know that for sure. I think the ring shank copper nails, I think were just available, and they certainly are still used in the boat industry. The kayak that I first built, that's actually where I think those are leftovers from that project. Those ring shank nails, and I think one is both copper and brass are pretty saltwater resistant. So most boat building, starts out on the coast where they're, in the ocean. So much of the materials that we have for boat building are actually saltwater resistant. So it's probably just evolution and what they made. So.
I suspect maybe the brass is even cheaper than the copper now.
It probably is, and they're probably just stamped out, and and the brass is softer than the copper for cinching on the wood. So yeah, and you can get them in all sizes, lengths, and things like that too. Yes, sir.
How heavy is this, particularly if it's a little older one and it's waterlogged and
Yeah, so that's
it's not like I bought a 65-pound lightweight Grumman and I thought I was in heaven.
yeah.
These things must be like 100 and some pounds when they get to that stage, right?
Well, I haven't weighed this one. It's probably 70 pounds. They're not light, and if we paddled it all summer, it would be more than 70 pounds for sure, because it will, water will get in and soak up eventually. I've heard of, Widgie over in Ely, they still paddle a lot of the old Saliga boats, and they get heavy as the summer goes on, but those kids heft those around all the time. Helps to be a lot younger, for sure. So.
We had an 18-foot chestnut. It weighed 96 after a trip.
Okay, so yeah, you start thinking about trips with shorter portages, or none.
or sons that can carry it.
Yeah, that is true. So Jamie, I don't know if Jamie mentioned that, one of my summer job is working for Tuscarora, run the towboat, and we towed out a family a week ago, and they've been coming up forever since, two owners of prior to Tuscarora. And then the dad, he gets out, he lifts the canoe off of the trailer and brings it over to the towboat and says, "That's the last time I'm touching the boat the whole trip." And they had three teenage sons and 3 teenage daughters, and he was good. So.
So I got roped into helping him replace the canvas on a chestnut, and we had the same sort of contraption he built that you built, and we only did one. But the bow and the stern was the trickiest part, I think. Does it get easier when you're stretching it over? Because it kept puckering, and you don't want those. Yeah,
you're right. It's in the way it's shaped, it gets narrow and it gets, swoopy down.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. You got to start in the middle and kind of work to both ends. And if you get a wrinkle in, you got to kind of keep the wrinkle moving ahead. Yeah. And there's a couple of spots. It wasn't all smooth. We had to pull staples a couple of times and go back. And it really helps because when you start stapling it, you kind of grab it with the pliers and you kind of pull it down too, so you can kind of. Right. It took a while to get a feel for it. Yeah. So it definitely is. I'm sure if you made 5 of these a day like those.
You get better at it.
Yeah, you get better at it. How many cranks will they come along to do.
Right.
Anything else? Anybody else?
Are you getting all your wood out of that canoe supply house in St. Paul, or can you get ash, that Quincy hardwood? Or?
So both wood is kind of hard to come by. So I do have a source down in Washburn, Wisconsin now that cuts a lot of ash and cedar for boat builders. So that's kind of where I'm talking to now for wood that I have. I had a friend down in Wisconsin that got a hold of a lot of ash, and he had it cut for just lumber and in pretty good lengths. Unfortunately, he had it dried or kiln dried, So for boats, it's kind of best to get air dried wood if you have to steam it, especially because kiln dried wood does not steam very well. In the kiln drying process, it kind of sets the cells so that they don't steam you can't steam them as tightly, takes longer, and it's more likely to pop back, not straight, but pop, lose some of your curve. So that's kind of where I'm targeting my wood now. It's a lot of the cedar for white cedar and stuff for boats, you have to go to Canada or Washington. It's hard to come by. So yeah, my next boat, I'll have to find a supply of wood is, so for a cedar strip canoe, that's typically red cedar, and I can go to the lumber yard, not the lumber yards up here, but some of the specialty ones in the cities, and buy a 16-foot 2x4 and just cut it in strips, and clear 2x4. Of course, it's $120 for a 2x4. So you're not going to build, but you can get four 2x4s will build one canoe. So $400 of wood, that's not awful.
What are the advantages or disadvantages of cedar strip versus a ribbed canvas?
Well, so I can get my cedar strip canoes to be about 50 pounds. So weight is certainly one of them. That one I think is probably going to be 70 pounds or so. Otherwise, cedar strip canoes do take longer to build. It takes me about 3 months if I'm working pretty hard. And a lot of that is you put a few strips on and since you're gluing them together, you gotta let the glue dry. Then that just takes time. And then because on a strip canoe, it's basically a wood shell and you put a fiberglass cloth with epoxy resin over it. Well, that takes time to put that on and let it cure and do the same thing. And then you flip it over, and there's a lot more sanding involved just to fair things out and get it smooth with a strip canoe, because you've got every 3/4 of an inch you've got a potential edge that you gotta smooth into the next one. Where even the wood canvas canoe, we certainly did plenty of sanding to smooth out the edges, but since most of the planks are 4 inches wide, there's a lot less edges to have to worry about. So that's easier. So I think the Old Town or these canoe companies that made them, they could make a canoe. I guess I should have looked this up, because one interesting thing is you can get the build records of all these canoes, like this 1937 Old Town that I have up in the garage. They've digitized or taken pictures of all the build records for Old Town, and I can see the date when they put the ribs on, the date that they finished the planking, the date that they put the goop on, and then the big gap before they put the gunnels on. So you can tell how long it took them to build, and they were pretty fast. So they could probably build a wood canvas canoe if you just counted the hours of that they actually worked on it, not had to set it aside, and probably less than a week for one. And if you're doing 20 at a time, that's pretty fast. So time is another I guess disadvantage, but yes, sir.
Are any of the traditional companies still making wood canvas canoes?
I think yes, they do, but I think they're all special order and stuff like that. I don't think they build them as stock items. I think Old Town, I don't know if Petersburg is still in business anymore. They've kind of all of them have merged and bought and sold, and their forms end up somewhere, and somebody buys it.
You've built plenty of them. Who's the typical person who wants them when you've got Kevlar out there?
I think it's just these traditionalists. So there's the Wooden Canoe Heritage Association, the WCHA, and they've got chapters all over the country, mostly in the East Coast, but there's a Midwestern chapter. I think might be Wisconsin or Illinois is where it's headquartered, but they have gatherings every summer, and it's just all kinds of old canoes and new canoes that that get together and paddle around and have parties and talk about how cool it is, and they dress up in costumes and all kinds of things. So.
My husband and I bought one of Mark's canoes, and answering your question, we bought it just because it's a work of art. You know, it's more than just a canoe, and it's definitely a piece of art.
And you use it?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So the canoe that Teresa referred to, that we did,
Uh-huh.
is all done with one exception. I haven't put the stem bands on yet.
Oh, okay.
Did you use a bedding compound when you did that?
Yeah, I do. Yep.
And what was it?
Well, curiously enough, that's the one mistake I regret on here. So actually, I just used some silicone caulk, and I think that's good enough. Unfortunately, the silicone caulk that I did has not setting up, so it's still gooey, and it's like 3 months. And so this winter, I'm gonna have to pull those off, wipe that all down, and get a different caulk for it. And I think it's something wrong with the caulk itself, even though it looked like a new tube. Or I looked at it, it said it's supposed to cure the container, but something's screwy on it. So, but I think just a silicone compound is fine.
Well, I know why I haven't finished it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, don't use what I use. Yes, ma'am.
Since you are self-taught, was there any part of the building process that really intimidated you before you started building it?
I think I was worried more about stretching the canvas, and just because everybody I talked to that did this, they built their shop and they bored these big holes and put these huge eye bolts in the concrete, and I think, oh cripes, I can't do that. I got in-floor heating in my shop. I'm not going to drill a hole in it. I'm going to hit a pipe. But yeah, it wasn't as bad as it turned out to be, and that was a relief that the mall did move, obviously. Credit to Jason McDonald Construction. But yeah, so that was my biggest worry in it. As I was thinking about, okay, there's a tree out back through the window. I could run a cable, but it turned out to be not that much. So I stressed over that.
I simplified when we've actually done it twice, but instead of using canvas, we used airplane fabric.
Dacron?
Dacron, and the nice feature of that is you take a warm iron, just kind of stretch it over and use the lacquer to seal it to the gun on the top edge. And then a warm iron, it shrinks. Of course, they've been doing that with airplanes since the 20s and 30s.
I think Alex has Stewart River is starting to do that too, and it's a lot lighter because the Dacron is a lot lighter than the canvas.
And it doesn't absorb water quite as much.
Yeah.
Inside the plank, you still can get heavier.
So I suppose eventually if I paddle this, and I will, because I make canoes to use, not to hang on the wall. Although the one in Bearskin still hanging on the wall. I probably will try the Dacron. Mike Bard's my friend that helped me. He's got a canoe that's got Dacron. They must not have got it quite right, but it's got some bubbles in it. But I've heard that's kind of the wave of the future. So, the wave of the future for the traditional wood canvas canoe is airplane fabric.
Dacron has been around since the 30s.
Yeah, so maybe that's
new description of future.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, we'd start in the 1800s and then get into the future.
What are you sealing the inside of it with?
So just boiled linseed oil to just as a first stir, and then just varnish, marine spar varnish. So.
This isn't on the canvas one, but on the cedar strip ones, that inset that you do of like the bear and the beaver and thing, what type of process do you use for that, as far as just fitting the pieces of wood together? So
I got a template that's got, it's either oval or round. That's the size of the, so I have a friend down in where we used to live that cuts those out for me.
Like a bandsaw?
It's actually scroll saw, so it's got a really fine blade, just like a wire. And so there's very minimal gaps in there. So he cuts out the design, and I give him a template with, okay, keep it in this circle. And so then I got a set of router bits, or a router bit with a collar that pops off. So you put the router collar on, you route the hole, and then you put it back, take it off, and then you route around the design, and then they just fit just exactly. Sometimes you need a little bit of sandpaper, but it just fits really nice. So. And I just glue it in. And now I got it, since there's no design on that one. So I usually put, on all my strip canoes, I'll inlay, as Teresa was talking about, some kind of a design. So typically I start out with moose, because hey, it's moose. And I've done wolves and bear and lynx and beaver, a loon, and I did one for a cousin, and she wanted a star, so I did a star. And so this one, I can't obviously route a hole in it, because that would make the canvas a problem. So I got to find an artist that can paint something on there. I'm definitely not an artist, at least a painting artist. So I got to get some kind of a design, just so I can say it's the loon canoe, or it's the bear canoe, or the beaver canoe. So.
Thank you so much.
You mentioned that. You mentioned design, and you talked about the different types of canoes. You know, birch, canvas, strips, and within those there are different designs.
Yeah, there's
so far
endless hull patterns. I guess.
I see.
Yeah, yeah. Some of them are built for, you know, hauling lots of stuff, you know, so they're bigger, rounder, fuller in the bow. Some of them are racing canoes, so they're narrower and sharper entry into the water. So, you know, I think sort of the more traditional one is kind of called was a chestnut, I guess, kind of, is basically the sort of the name of the hull. And it's, you know, typically rounded, it's about 16 feet long, and it's, you know, pretty good all-around boat. It's a good tripper, it's a good paddle around the lake on a sunny day, it's a good fishing boat, but yeah, there's all kinds of styles. Solo canoes tend to be narrower because you're paddling in the middle where it's widest. You need to reach the water. Then of course there's the, most canoes have some tumble home. That's where it kind of comes in a little bit at the top or the gunnels. That can provide some secondary stability. So once you sit in it, it's stable, and once you lean it over, some canoes you start leaning and all of a sudden you're in the water. Other canoes you can lean them over and they actually get even more solid. So that's what tumble home can do for you.
So is the keel completely flat, or do some of the designs have some hook in them?
Yeah, so this one has a little bit, it's called rocker.
Yeah.
So it comes up about maybe an inch and a half at both ends from 17 feet. A lot of the modern Kevlar canoes are pretty flat, so they don't turn easy as well. So, and they're mostly lake canoes. If you've got a canoe that's going to be a whitewater canoe, they'll have a lot more rocker so that they can maneuver on rocks and things like that. So yeah, there's a lot of science behind that.
Yeah.
I've built a lot of canoes, but I've pretty much bought the plans for them from somebody that knows what they're doing. I didn't take one of those and shrink it, you know, down to a solo canoe from a 17 foot to a 15 foot, and that turned out really well. There's tricks to that, but I just, you know, read a book. Anyway, but yeah, there's just all kinds of varieties. It takes so much time and costs, you know, so much money, you know, $1,500, $2,000 to build a canoe of materials, and not counting my time because, hey, I'm retired, that I don't feel like I want to blow $2,000 and get a canoe that's, you know, basically a log. So I typically tend to buy a canoe that plans that comes with all the shape stations and stuff like that. And if I make any modifications, it's usually in the outer water stuff. You know, modifying in choice of materials, the design of that kind of stuff, personalized like that. So, Anyway, that's my story.
Bravo.